What are data cleaning techniques? I'm going to go through and just very briefly run through the processes that we would typically go through. Data cleaning and data hygiene really is a bore and a chore for most database managers. We know that, we understand that, but I think everyone knows it's an absolute necessity. And so basically it's a dirty job, but we do it for you. The way that we would typically run through a data hygiene process would be, first of all, to format the data. We need to make sure that all the towns are in the right town field, that all the names are in the right name field, that the postcode's in the postcode field, and so on and so forth. So the first stage we go through is data formatting, and we typically do that by running what's called pathing, the post office address file, which is the single database that the post office maintains of every single address in the UK. So the first thing we do is to take the records, match them against the path file, update and clean them. So we now have a nice cleaned version of the data with all the fields in the right place. The next step that we then look at would be to basically run the deduplication exercise. This is where we make sure that there's no duplicates in your database. So if you've got multiple versions of Mark Robinson in the database, at the end of the processing that we would run, you'd have a single version of Mark Robinson in the database. And we use a number of different techniques called fuzzy matching, where we create and define specific keys around the data set to ensure that they're matching. Things like phonetics, so that Mark spelt with a K would always match with Mark spelt with a C. So if you've got two versions of Mark Robinson because someone spelt it wrongly, our solution will pick that up, our processing will pick that up. Having deduped the data, the next stage is then to look at the contacts. So we would typically run through the contacts. We may create, so making sure that forenames are in forenames, surnames are in surname field, and of course titles in title. We'd like to make sure, because it's always kind of useful to make sure that your salutation is correct for the name. So being sent something to Mrs. Mark Robinson is not cool, and I don't want that. I would really like my name title changing to Mr. Mark Robinson. So we'd run that kind of a processing to make sure that salutation is correct. The next part may be running suppressions. Now, this is a really crucial part of any campaign hygiene. If you're mailing to consumers, if your audience is a consumer audience, then you must be making sure that there's no one that's died in your audience. So if you have your database, you need to run it against the deceased files, the mortality files, make sure that those unfortunately deceased people are removed. We need to make sure that if people have moved addresses, you've got the correct addresses. If a company has changed company name or changed any of their details, that's all, again, all correct. So that will be the next phase of running the data hygiene. Following on from there, we then look at potentially appending or enhancing the data. So many clients want to add demographics on, whether they be B2B database or a B2C database. And by demographics, I mean things like, if it's a B2B, you may want to know what SIC, what sector the business is in, number of employees, so we can get a feel for how big the organisation is, their turnover, their financial information. We can append all that information, which will then help for segmentation and targeting and analysis. If it's a consumer, we may want to add things on like possibly council tax bands, so we can get a feel for the wealth of the individual. We may want to be adding on things like gender, if we don't already have that. We may want to append things like age, so we can look at age band. Now, all of that information can then be enhanced and appended onto the data set through that data hygiene processing. That, very briefly, is a quick explanation of a very dull subject.